and welcome. My name is Meredith McFarland, and I have an MLIS and a BA with a focus in European history. I've been specializing in Celtic history for many years, and you may have heard this talk before at the Flagstaff Highland Games. Today I'm going to be teaching you a bit about the history of the Scottish clan system, beginning with the background history of Scotland, and then moving on to the nitty-gritty details of the clans, septs, heraldry, and tartans. First, before giving the talk, I would like to thank our guarantors for the games. They are the Arizona Commission on the Arts, the Flagstaff Arts Council, the Arizona Community Foundation, City of Flagstaff, and Coconino County. All right, let's begin. After the Ice Ages receded from Scotland by 8000 BC, wandering tribes from Central Europe made their way into what later became England, Scotland, and Ireland, where they settled in small groups. Historians dubbed these people Celts because they all spoke forms of the Proto-Celtic language. The Celts hunted and fished to maintain their existence, but by 3000 BC, these people began using farming techniques that enabled them to create a surplus of crops and grow their settlements. However, in 1159 BC, the Icelandic volcano Hekla erupted and caused tsunamis, ash clouds, and violent thunderstorms that created a volcanic winter which lasted for a generation. The peoples were almost wiped out, and the climate change that ensued has lasted until today, creating the different zones that make up the highlands and the lowlands of Scotland. People in the west were no longer able to rely on farming, as the constant rains and wet climate made sustaining crops impossible. They resorted to rearing cattle and sheep, which could prosper in the peat bogs. Because the Celts lived in decentralized tribes who had no singular, or often any ruler, territorial conflicts arose frequently. Warriors and warlords offered protection to those who were unable to defend themselves in return for food and other services. This social structure lasted through the century into the time of the clans, and these were the early beginnings of what came to be the clan system over time. Over the next millennium, Celtic culture grew and developed, as did the tribe's military might. In 83 AD, the Caledonians, who were an organized group of possibly Pictish tribes composed of farmers and hill fort builders, formed the Caledonian Confederacy to fight Roman invaders. During that year, the Roman Emperor Claudius had decided that he needed to become more famous and increase his military notoriety. He sent several of his generals into the highlands so that they could conquer the Scottish tribes for the Roman Empire. Once the Romans had camped in Celtic territory, they were ambushed by a group of Caledonians who were allegedly led by a warrior named Calgacus. This battle caused the first recorded instance of the Highland Charge, which involves unearthly yelling and a terrifying number of Scotsmen who are armed to the teeth running straight at you. For anyone uninitiated to Celtic battle tactics, I can assure you that this would be an absolutely terrifying sight. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Emperor Honorius decided to remove his legions from Scotland, since barbarians were directly attacking the city of Rome, so Scotland was left to local tribes. At that time, Scotland was populated by 4 distinct groups of peoples. There were the mysterious Picts, who had been pirates and raiders during the early years of Roman occupation, but now farmed in the Eastern Highlands. The Britons lived in the Strathclyde region, which was in southwestern Scotland and northern England. They spoke the Brythonic language and originally traveled up from France. The Angles were Germanic invaders who became auxiliary forces for the Roman legions. Once the Romans left, the Angles invaded Northumbria, took over the southwestern side of Scotland, and became known as the Northumbrians. And finally, the Scots lived in the western half of the Highlands. These Scots, who were called Scoti or Scotias, were actually from northeastern Irish tribes and fully invaded the region once the Romans left. The word Scotias was a Briton term meaning raiders. Around 500 AD, there was a mass migration from Ireland, and the Scots developed their ancient kingdom of Dalriada on the Argyll coast. In 793, the Norse Vikings landed in Scotland and began pillaging monasteries. The northernmost tip of Scotland, including Orkney, Shetland, and all of the islands of the Hebrides, fell under the Vikings' control. After a while, the Vikings settled down in Scotland and ended up intermixing with many of the peoples who were already there, which is why many clans can trace their lineage back to Norwegian descent. However, the Scots and Picts had united to fight against the Viking threat, which led to the downfall of the Picts. The Picts had a matrilineal society, which meant that family lines descended from women. The Scots, on the other hand, had a patrilineal society, so once they started marrying the Picts were essentially married out of existence over the course of several hundred years. The Picts and the Scots developed their own Kingdom of Alba in the west in 850 AD, which became an important place because it was the location where feudalism really began to develop in Scotland. Fun fact, Macbeth, who was infamously depicted in Shakespeare's play, was the king of Alba from 1040 to 1057 AD. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the French Normans traveled north from England, attacked the Scottish mainland, and worked their way into the clans as well. At this point, Scotland was a giant melting pot of all these different peoples and their cultures. Families intermarried, swore allegiance to one another, or fought to the death, and eventually everyone became known as Scots, no matter what their original background was. And as you can see here, this is where all of the different groupings used to be before they became a unified Scottish region up in the north. The earliest known clans formed in the 11th century, but most clans with accurate histories and lines of lineage began in the 13th and 14th centuries. Clans were very territorial and often had bloody disputes over who had the right to control certain areas of land and crops that the previous tribes had owned the land had done for centuries beforehand. The tension between clans was often unproductive, as shown in the famous Battle of the Clans. Occurring in 1336, this skirmish involved 38 members from the clans of Chattan and Cameron, who fought gladiatorial style to the death over a territorial legal dispute until only 10 Chattans and 2 Camerons were left. Constant infighting proved that the Scots were formidable enemies. They also united to fight against enemies that threatened all of the clans, as the tribes of the Caledonian Confederacy had done. Many English kings tried different tactics to disband the clans and make them easier to control. However, no one king could take over all of Scotland because of the sheer number of clans that fought against the English, and because all the clans were in turn warring against each other. Instead of the phrase herding cats, I like to say herding clans. King James VI, for example, had so much trouble with the MacGregor clan that he made it a crime to go by the name of MacGregor. Nevertheless, James's policy didn't have the effect he wanted. The MacGregor clan simply dispersed and took the names of other clans, like Drummond, Murray, and Grant, who gave them shelter. Removing a clan's name was just one of the many ways in which the kings tried to eliminate the clans. As time wore on and lands were firmly claimed by one clan or another, disagreements either arose from continuing ancient feuds or disagreements concerning national politics. By the 18th century, the clans still felt a strong attachment to their ancestral lands, but no longer had such a strong claim to them. Years of infighting against the British had weakened the clan system, and chiefs fiercely defended what remained of their lands. James IV officially ruled the land of Scotland, but he created a rift between the legislators and the actual clan members when he decided to move from the royal court from Scotland to London. The English created the Black Watch in 1724 in order to police the glens and enforce their new rules and regulations designed to limit clan activity and membership. Ironically, the Watch was composed of Scottish clans. There were 3 companies of Campbells and 1 each of Frasers, Grants, and Munros. The Black Watch also helped enforce the Highland clearances, where entire towns were forced to vacate by the order of the English king. The conflict between the English and the Scottish clans culminated in the Battle of Culloden in 1746, after which the clans were left broken and disbanded. Many of the members left Scotland and traveled elsewhere. Many headed to America. Farmers were forced off their ancestral lands and formed small communities called crofts. 30 of the major clans then came out in support of Prince Charles, who was the eldest son of James Francis Edward Stuart, in turn the son of James VII of Scotland and II of England. These kings had the right to rule Scotland, but had been deposed during the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and were replaced by Mary II and William of Orange. Many of the clans believed that Prince Charles, who was also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, was their rightful king. They called themselves Jacobites after the Latin word for James, Jacobus. Jacobitism was a political cause that overtook Scotland and protested the English Parliament's decision to interfere with the Scottish line of succession through English kings. The Jacobites wanted James II and his heirs to be returned to the throne so that Scotland's best interests could be maintained. Because of the Jacobites' uproar over the new English royalty, they were attacked by British troops who seized their lands after the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745. Tartans, bagpipes, and kilts were banished, and all weapons were taken from them. It took a generation after the Battle of Culloden, which was the final conflict of the Jacobite rebellion, before people began returning to the empty land, as poetry and stories about the legends of the Scots and their clans began circulating, painting the land in a romantic and adventurous light. As Scottish culture slowly began to deteriorate, the last known instance of the Highland Charge took place when the Fraser Highlanders were sent to the Heights of Abraham in Quebec, Canada, under the leadership of General James Wolfe during the 7 Years' War. During the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, the Queen brought back interest to Scottish traditions and clans after she fell in love with Scotland. She took up winter residence starting every year in August in Balmoral Castle, which had originally belonged to the Farquharsons of Inverie. She loved Highland whiskey and was a strong supporter of the Braemar Gathering, which was a precursor to the current Highland Games, and featured many of the same sporting competitions that you'll see here today. She loved tartans and made her guests wear kilts to all her Highland balls. After the Highland Land League was founded in London in the 1880s, clans began officially reforming, starting with Clan MacNaughton in 1878 and followed by Clan Mackay in 1888. In the summer of 2009, there was a gathering of the clans in Edinburgh. Many predicted that the event would be met with disaster and that no one would show up. However, over 60,000 members and supporters of the clans showed up from all over the world, sparking an interest in clan membership again. Now that I've gone over a very abbreviated version of Scotland's clan history, I'm going to give an overview of the clans themselves and their structure, their heraldry and garb, and their division into septs. Roman observers had considered the entirety of the Celtic lands to be one land called Britannia. Because the different regions of the land were governed by different peoples, languages, and traditions, and the languages were P-Celtic and Q-Celtic, two distinct Celtic languages that vary by their pronunciation of the letters P and Q, the notion of a single Celtic identity didn't arise until 19th century historians tried to find a singular term that they could use to refer to the Celtic peoples as a group. The word Celts came from the Celtae or Celtoi, who were peoples that inhabited the southwest of Europe before the Romans came to power. However, there is actually no correlation between the two different Celts aside from their shared name. Once the clans started forming, they were divided by the extreme geographics between the Highlands and the Lowlands. The Lowlanders shunned the Highlanders as they considered them to be wild barbarians. The Lowlanders were much calmer and less prone to fight than were their Highlander counterparts. Lowlanders farmed and raised livestock such as sheep and goats. To Highlanders, life meant cattle farming because cattle were the only animals who could survive in the rocky and harsh landscape. Clan lands were the ancestral right of chiefs and were subdivided between their family members and clansmen. In larger or more dispersed clans, chiefs would delegate a lot of the duties to tacksmen. The tacksmen were usually relatives or members of the gentry who maintained the farmland and pastures. They existed somewhat in the middle of this social hierarchy, since they collected rent from lower status tenants and sublet their own portion of the land to farmers. They would divide the land into rotating portions, so clansmen planted crops, and the tacksmen would see the cutting of bracken, which are large rough ferns, and peat, which is a wet boggy type of soil, around the lands belonging to the clan. The tacksmen were also the chief's fighting force. They were required to round up their fellow clansmen in arms at a moment's notice to defend their lands. In both war and peace, chiefs had absolute control over their people, though this right to rule was based on ancient custom rather than legal right. Kingship was stronger than any judicial law, and the hierarchy was God, the chief, and the clansman. There was an extreme sense of pride based on which clan you were in, and intense loyalty ran rampant. For example, at the Battle of Culloden, as the Highlanders gathered to fight the British, they were grouped together by clans and septs to create a unified but still slightly independent fighting force. Clans looked to each other for support in troubled times, and official rulers or kings were either seen as allies or enemies and not the supreme law. This created much conflict as English kings strove to take over the Scottish lands again and again over time. As much as the clans were divided based on the landscape of Scotland, they were also divided by social progress. Because political troubles were often very regionalized and centered around certain clans conflicting with English kings, these regions didn't have the time to socially progress as fast as other areas were able to. While the Highlanders struggled with King James IV over who was the rightful owner of their lands, the Lowlanders were living in relative peace. In the lowlands, burghs or self-sufficient towns prospered, while the arts, learning, and culture progressed rapidly. However, this was short-lasting as King James settled problems in England and turned his attention to the Scottish lowlands. One of the major sources of conflict between Scotland and England came from the fact that if the Scots were rebelling or not cooperating with the English king's commands, England's trade and power of leadership were diminished. The Renaissance and the Reformation came late to Scotland, especially to certain areas, partly owing to the fact that the Scots were content with the structure of their society, and partly because their relations with neighboring countries were hampered. Also, the Church held half of Scotland's national wealth, which led to internal corruption and poverty. If you take an in-depth look at Scottish history, you can see how the influence of many different European peoples, social and political issues, and even geographical locations helped create the many Scottish clans. With that being said, the clans and septs are often very divergent, as are their styles of heraldry and garb. The word clan comes from the Gaelic word clan, meaning children. I should reiterate that clan names identified not only people, but where they lived geographically. For example, people from Clan Mackenzie were originally the actual descendants of Gillian of the Aird, who was the founder of the clan. These original founders were called name fathers, and they often lived between 1150 and 1350 AD. Several clans even stem from the times of the early Middle Ages, beginning around 400 AD, and one of the most notable ones, Clan Sinead MacAlpin, comes from a Pictish kin group that ran the Kingdom of Alba. Clans often claimed descent from legendary heroes and kings to prove their claim to certain parts of the territory. For example, Clan Donald claimed descent from the Irish King Con, who was an ancient hero. Clan Campbell believed that they had descended from another Irish hero, Diarmid the Boar. Clans are also originated from all over Europe. Remember the French Normans and the German Angles? And tribes of people moved around, either conquering or pillaging, or creating alliances. The name of MacDonald is Norse in origin, but they have the most relation to Ireland, ironically. The Bruces came from northwestern France as de Bruce or de Burrs, and the Stuarts came from the Brittany region of France. Clan names were often as diverse as their clan's genealogy. So the prefix Mac means son of, Mackenzie means son of Kenzie. Nick or Mick were the prefaces for women, and they meant daughter of. For example, Aoife Nick Matuna meant daughter of Sean. The feminine forms of surnames were much more commonly used among Irish settlers. You may have heard that the prefix Mac is Scottish and that Mick is Irish, or that these prefixes divided clans into septs. However, this is not true. Mac, Mick, Ma, and M apostrophe were used interchangeably, varying from who documented the name, to personal preference, to what time and place in history they came for. But Mac and Mick are the only two forms that were used today. And here are the feminine surnames. So far, we've examined official clans that have chiefs, but what about clans that no longer have a chief or who were never recognized as an official clan? Armigerous clans are those who are recognized by the court of the Lord Lion, but who do not have a chief who is recognized by the court. For example, a leaderless clan. The Court of the Lord Lion is a standing court of law in Scotland which grants clans the right to wear certain tartans and present coats of arms, and it also has the best records of Scottish genealogy. Armigerous clans have no legal standing in Scottish law and are not recognized as a noble community. For example, clans Fenton, Forrester, and Armstrong are Armigerous clans. They often carry undifferenced arms, which are those that have no marks distinguishing the bearer by birth, order, or family position. These plain coats of arms are passed down generationally from father to eldest son, and only one person may bear them at any time. Other descendants may use them any time, but must change them slightly in some way in order to do so. Official clans change their heraldry for each new generation, but the clan crest remains the same. It's often impossible to tell whether or not a clan is Armigerous just by looking at their crests or coats of arms. So for example, we have the Clan MacNaughton crest and the Clan McFarland crest. And then we also have Clan Scott crest, Clan Fenton, and Clan Armstrong. And these two are Armigerous clans, but you really can't tell the difference between any of these. Clans Clans can also become armigerous over time if the ancestral line of chiefs dies out or no one claims chiefdom of the clan. These clans often continue to wear the heraldry and crests of their last chief. Clan McFarland is an example of a clan becoming armigerous, as the last known chief died in 1866 and no one stepped forward to claim chiefdom. However, the court now considers the society president to be a sort of stand-in in place of the chief. As you can see, the legal structure of the Scottish clans can be very complicated. Now, on to kilts, those lovely breathable garments which you must never call a skirt by any means. The word kilt is actually English, to add insult to injury. It means to tuck or hitch up a skirt. Tartan comes from the Old French word tireten, which means heavy material of no particular color. Kilts are not the same thing as tartans. Kilts can be made of plain material, but they often have a tartan pattern distinguishing the clan that wears them. To make things more confusing, Americans call tartan plaid, but in Scotland, plaid is a cloth made of tartan that is slung over the shoulder and worn as an accessory to a kilt. Until the middle of the 19th century, specific tartans belonged to different regions of Scotland, partly owing to the fact that certain dyes were readily available only in certain areas, and local tastes in colors and patterns differed. Dyes sometimes symbolize the natural resources of a particular area, green for forests, yellow for certain crops, and blues for lakes and rivers. Tartan dyes were also a sign of wealth. Since it was prohibitively expensive to transport dyes cross-country, those clans that had access to rare dyes flaunted that privilege through their kilts. After interest in clans began rising again in the mid-19th century, clans began claiming specific patterns and colors of tartan as their own in order to honor their heritage. However, as tartans hadn't been individually used by the clans before, there were few historical reasons for certain designs to go to each clan. You'll often hear people use phrases such as modern, ancient, hunting, and dress when referring to tartan. So modern refers to the use of modern artificial dyes, which makes kilts very brightly colored. Ancient means that the colors are more muted, as if they'd faded over time. Hunting tartans were often used for, take a guess, hunting. They tend to have more greens and browns in them so that the wearer can blend into the natural environment. Dress tartans usually have a lot more white thread woven into them, with the exception of the MacLeod dress kilt that uses yellow instead of white. There are two ways you can be part of a clan without having direct descent from the chiefs of the clan. To be part of a clan doesn't mean that one has any actual blood ties to the clan. In fact, as I said before, most clan members weren't actually related to their clan at all. The vast majority of clansmen were tenants who swore a blood oath to the chief in order to seek protection against outside forces, to show solidarity, or simply to survive. When surnames became popular in the 16th and 17th centuries, many clansmen adopted the last name of their chief, despite their lack of relations. The term sept comes from the Latin word septum, which means enclosure or fold, and came to define a division of a family. Translated into Irish Gaelic, the word sept becomes slacht, which means progeny or seed. The term began being used heavily in the 19th century to explain the variety of surnames that were used or claimed by a single clan. In Scottish society, septs defined those who were members of a specific clan and inhabited the same territory. Septs were families who followed a chief or a different surname. For example, the clan Donachie has many septs, some of which are Roy, Roberts, Collier, and Stark. Septs could be related to a major clan through marriage or simply allegiance. Bonds of manrent also tied clans and septs together. These were arrangements between a sept and a clan so that the weaker group could have protection from enemies. The bonds of manrent created a system that resembled the vassal system that was prevalent in the rest of medieval Europe between the lords and the serfs. Septs would often eventually split into more septs, which led to the creation of new surnames all across Scotland. When Scotsmen traveled to America, their thick accents often led immigration clerks to write down the wrong name, leading to even more separation between the septs and the clans. For example, the surname McCracken is a sept of MacNaughton. The name MacNaughton was mispronounced over time from MacNaughton to McCrockton to McCracken. Scotsmen could also choose their own spelling in many cases, especially if they didn't encounter immigration clerks. And that's part of the reason why there are at least 5 ways to spell McFarland, which can get very confusing, believe me. There are no legal lists that state which septs belong to which clans, and many septs are related to more than one clan. In addition, many septs became clans of their own as they gained fame and members. Well, now that you know the difference between clans and septs, and quite a bit of the history of Scotland, I think that's enough information for today. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email at this address. Thank you.